Hi everyone, this is Dr. Bryan Bingham of Compass Chiropractic here in Indianapolis, Indiana, and today we're going to be talking about the glycemic index. And the glycemic index, basically we're going to be looking at how we can use this to pick certain foods that are going to be beneficial if we're trying to maybe lose weight, or also to prevent those crashes that we get usually at about 2 or 3 in the afternoon that send us to the vending machine looking for snacks. So the glycemic index was first developed by Dr. David Jenkins. He was a professor of nutrition at the University of Toronto. He developed this because he was working with diabetics, and he wanted to find a system that he could present to his patients that would allow them to pick certain foods that wouldn't prevent or wouldn't cause these high spikes in blood sugar. And what he found was a system that was not only beneficial for diabetics but also for patients that were considered healthy. It was also a way for them to keep their blood sugar level without causing these big spikes that tend to often lead to weight gain. So the definition of the glycemic index is it's an index of foods that has a ranking of carbohydrate exchanges in foods according to their immediate impact on the blood glucose levels. So we're going to go into that in more detail and explain that as we go along here. So why is the glycemic index important? Well, anything that we take into our body causes our blood sugar to rise, and what we need to do is find foods that cause that blood sugar rise, but not to cause an immediate spike and then immediate drop. That's going to help us lose weight. That's going to help us prevent from having those cravings that we talked about at the kind of mid-afternoon hours. So certain foods into the bloodstream, they cause an immediate spike in in blood sugar. These foods are called high glycemic index foods, and other foods that don't cause that drastic spike in blood sugar are called low glycemic index foods. So there's a few factors that affect the glycemic index and cause foods to be either high or low on the glycemic index. Few of these I'm going to go through in more detail, and some of them not so much because I don't feel like they're as important. Starch gelatinization, I'm not going to go into much detail. Physical entrapment, we'll talk about that a little bit. Particle size, basically the larger the particle, the slower it's going to be absorbed into the bloodstream, and therefore the lower the glycemic index. Also, fiber is very important. Foods that have fiber tend to get digested slower, and when they get digested slower, then we don't have that big spike in blood sugar. The amount of sugar in a food obviously affects the glycemic index. Foods that have a high acidity tend to be low in the glycemic index, and foods that have fat in them tend to be absorbed a lot slower and therefore tend to be lower on the glycemic index. So physical entrapment, real quick, when we look at this, the coating around the kernel here is bran. That slows down the digestion, therefore lowering the glycemic index. When we have processed foods, that tends to be taken off, and what we're left with is more of the high glycemic index parts of the food. So the agricultural revolution brought about a lot of carbohydrates, but these were carbohydrates in the form of whole grains. These carbohydrates provided for long-lasting nutrients that prevented us from having these hunger pangs throughout the day, provided a great fuel. But then when the industrial age came along, it brought along a lot of machinery that processed these foods, and what it did, it took out a lot of the elements that were very important in providing that long-lasting fuel, and what we were left with was a very tasty food, but it also was very high had a high glycemic index. So what we'll look at here, these are the different parts of, for example, whole wheat kernel. We have the bran, which is fiber-rich, the endosperm, which is white flour, and the germ, which is vitamin-rich. So when we process food, what happens is we end up with the endosperm is the only thing that's left. That's our white flour. These are refined carbs, white breads, pastas. These are very high glycemic index foods. And what we do is we end up discarding some of these very important parts, which are the germ, which is very vitamin rich, and the bran, which has a lot of fiber, which all of us could get a little bit more in our diet. So this is how the body sees a carbohydrate. It comes into the system. It causes an immediate increase in blood sugar. The pancreas says we've got to do something about this. Blood sugar is too high. It releases insulin. Insulin looks for a place to put this sugar, and typically it finds that fat is one of the best places to store it, stores it in the fat, the blood sugar drops, and the body starts craving sugar once again. So here we're looking at how the body sees glucose. Glucose is the top of the scale. It causes 100% reaction in the blood sugar. Once we understand that, then everything else is relative to that 100. So the top of the scale is 100. When we look at something like lentils, for example, is a 29. It obviously has a very low glycemic index as compared to sugar or glucose. But we look at something like white bread that has a 70 on this scale on the glycemic index. That's not that much lower than sugar, so what that's going to cause is this immediate spike and an immediate drop following that, which is going to leave you craving carbohydrates or sugar later on in the day. So the reason that I brought this up, this has been a question a lot of people have had. They look at carrots and they see carrots have such a high glycemic index, higher than sponge cake, which obviously doesn't seem to make sense to most people, because if you were using common sense and trying to pick certain foods, you would guess that, well, obviously I'm going to pick carrots because they're going to be healthier. The reason that's the case, the amount of carbohydrates that are in a particular serving of carrots is very low compared to sponge cake. So there's another index basically that was created to take that in consideration. That's called the glycemic load. And we look at the glycemic load, we can see that on the left here, this is the amount of carbs per serving. We see 36, and amount of carbs per serving, we see 6. So you'd have to eat a bushel of carrots to actually get to that 47 on the glycemic index. But when we take into account the glycemic load, we see a 17, which is very high, compared to a 3, which is very low. So I always recommend taking into consideration both of these, but really focus on the glycemic load. That's going to give you your amount of carbs per serving, which is, in my opinion, probably a better way to pick your foods. So glycemic index wasn't intended to be used in isolation. It's just it's a way to help you pick certain foods that will prevent those cravings, help you lose weight or maintain a healthy weight. Changing the way you eat, a couple quick tips here. Make these changes gradually. Don't try to take on everything all at once. Start with your easiest changes first. You know, if you have something that you love, you eat it every day, don't start with that one, because you're going to find yourself disappointed. Start with something that you know that you can tackle, and then use that, and then say that the following month try something else after that. And break your big goals down into a number of smaller, more achievable goals, like I mentioned earlier, and accept lapses in your habits. If you do have a problem, let's say one weekend you go out and you have that sponge cake, don't beat yourself up. Just get back on track starting on Monday. So a lot of food manufacturers are looking at glycemic index, and they're interested in this because they're seeing the popularity. You might start to see these labels on different foods. So look for this, and also when you're trying to determine which foods have a high glycemic index or low glycemic index, a great resource is the glycemicindex.com that I have listed here. Definitely go there. There's a index where you can type in whatever food you're looking for, then it will give you the glycemic index and the glycemic load. All right, that's what I have for today. Once again, this is Dr. Bryan Bingham of Compass Chiropractic in Indianapolis, Indiana. My website is www.compassindy.com, and email address is drdc@compassindy.com. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact me. Thanks.